Now we go. Queridos amigos, les recuerdo que este evento cuenta con traducción simultánea español-inglés, inglés-español, para la que tienen que elegir el idioma en la imagen del globo en la parte inferior de sus pantallas. Y también dejarles saber que está siendo transmitido este evento a través de YouTube. Please remember that simultaneous translation is being provided for this event. You just need to click on the icon of a globe at the bottom of your screen and select the language for which you need interpretation. Did you find that Raymond? So you can follow me because I'm going to switch to Spanish. Okay. Buenos días y gracias por sumarse a otro de nuestros seminarios digitales. En esta ocasión vamos a explorar en detalle los aspectos fundamentales de la relación entre China y Estados Unidos, como sabemos, las dos economías más grandes del mundo, al tiempo que los dos países más poderosos de nuestra era y actores definitivos que le dan forma a lo que generalmente referimos como el orden internacional. De la evolución o involución de los vínculos entre Washington y Beijing dependen muchos aspectos cruciales para la humanidad en su conjunto. Desde luego, la paz y estabilidad, condiciones básicas para un adecuado desenvolvimiento de la economía, el comercio y las inversiones, así como tantos otros ámbitos claves para los prospectos de desarrollo. En mayor o menor medida, el estado y calidad de los lazos entre estas dos naciones impone complejos desafíos políticos para todo el mundo. Pero ¿qué duda cabe de que eso está especialmente acentuado para países como el nuestro, de economía altamente orientada al mundo y que tiene en los dos gigantes que nos ocupan a dos socios imprescindibles? Realizamos esta actividad, además, pasada ya algunas semanas de la cumbre, el mes pasado en Beijing, entre los presidentes Xi Jinping y Donald Trump. Tiempo suficiente nos parece para favorecer un análisis riguroso de sus resultados y sobre todo para tratar de proyectar cursos de acción e implicancias, al menos en el mediano plazo. Sabemos que la cumbre del mes pasado fue la primera de una secuencia anunciada de encuentros de máximo nivel entre chinos y estadounidenses, la que incluiría otra cumbre entre las dos máximas autoridades a fin de año en territorio estadounidenses. Las condiciones para el intercambio comercial bilateral, que permanece bajo un esquema general tensionado, producto de alzas arancelarias, es un ámbito clave para la salud de la economía global. Sabemos, sin embargo, que en el horizonte cercano asuman riesgos de enorme sensibilidad, como la situación con Taiwán, que conviene monitorear muy de cerca. Vale la pena destacar, por último, que la rivalidad y competencia entre las dos potencias globales se desarrolla y toma su forma particular también en América Latina, lo que, por cierto, incluye a nuestro país. Un escenario regional con presencia cada vez más asertiva de ambos por medio del comercio y las inversiones en sectores estratégicos, que es protagonista de primer orden de las relaciones entre China y Estados Unidos. Por eso nuestra pregunta de hoy: ¿qué podemos esperar? Y para hablar de todo esto y con seguridad muchos más aspectos relacionados, hoy tenemos el honor de contar en nuestro panel con tres expertos de auténtica clase mundial, todos de reconocidas instituciones a los que paso a presentar. Scott Kennedy es asesor senior y presidente del Consejo Directivo de Negocios y Economía China en el Centro de Estudios Estratégicos e Internacionales CSIS. Destacado experto en política económica china y relaciones comerciales entre Estados Unidos y China, Scott ha viajado a este último país durante los últimos 37 años. Sus áreas de interés incluyen el impulso a la innovación en China, la política industrial china, las relaciones entre Estados Unidos y China y la gobernanza económica global. Sus artículos han aparecido en una amplia gama de medios, incluyendo The New York Times, The Wall Street Journal, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy y el China Quarterly. Con anterioridad fue profesor en la Universidad de Indiana, donde fundó el Centro de Investigación sobre Políticas y Negocios Chinos. Luego, Amanda Xiao, I don't know if I pronounced it well, Amanda. Xiao, okay. Es directora en la división china de Eurasia Group, donde se especializa en política exterior china y las relaciones entre China y Taiwán. Anteriormente, Amanda trabajó durante más de una década en Asia, en Singapur, Beijing y Taipei, analizando las políticas exteriores y de seguridad chinas desde la perspectiva de la gestión de crisis y la prevención de conflictos. Como analista senior sobre China del International Crisis Group, Amanda siguió de cerca la dinámica política subyacente a las tensiones en la periferia de China, incluidos el estrecho de Taiwán y la frontera sino-india, y con Estados Unidos. Previamente, fundó el programa sobre China del Centro para el Diálogo Humanitario en Beijing, donde diseñó y facilitó diálogos con interlocutores chinos sobre temas como las tensiones en el mar de China Meridional, las relaciones entre Estados Unidos y China y la evolución del enfoque chino hacia la mediación de conflictos. Sus análisis sobre China han aparecido en medios como The New York Times, The Washington Post, The Guardian, Nikkei Asia, BBC y War on the Rocks. Y finalmente, pero no por ello menos importante, Raymond Kuo es el vicepresidente de investigación en geoestrategia del Chicago Council on Global Affairs. También es investigador principal de estudios asiáticos en esa prestigiosa institución, donde se centra en la competencia entre Estados Unidos y China, la dinámica de las alianzas y el orden regional en el Indo-Pacífico. Anteriormente, Raymond fue el director fundador de la Iniciativa de Política de Taiwán y politólogo senior en RAND, reconocido centro de estudios. Es experto en seguridad internacional, orden internacional y Asia Oriental. Sus trabajos han aparecido en publicaciones como International Security, Journal of Conflict Resolution, Foreign Affairs y The National Interest, entre otras. También ha trabajado para las Naciones Unidas y el Instituto Nacional Demócrata. Sin más, entonces, le cedo la palabra al primero de los expositores, que será Amanda, quien se concentrará en los asuntos políticos y de seguridad. Le seguirá luego Scott, quien pondrá especial atención a la dimensión económica, y Raymond, que abordará una mirada más regional para el Asia-Pacífico. Y desde ya les invito a que hagan sus preguntas en cualquier momento en el chat o a través del botón de preguntas y respuestas que está en la parte de abajo de sus pantallas. Muchas gracias de nuevo a todos y Amanda, you have the floor, please.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you so much to the Chile Pacific Foundation for the invitation. It's a real honor to be included on this panel with Scott and Raymond. And I'm very much looking forward to learning from their remarks as well. Would it be possible to share my presentation? And then I will get started. Wonderful, thank you so much. Great, next slide, please. So today I'll be focused on the political dimensions of the US-China relationship. These are some of the top elements of my presentation going forward. Next slide, please. Great, so on the whole, the May summit in Beijing was a strong signal of bilateral stability for the near term. Now, the vibes throughout the summit were extremely positive. President Trump himself was quite enthusiastic about the event, about President Xi, and the outcomes. The Chinese really rolled out the red carpet. There was a lot of ceremony, and this was all aimed at making President Trump feel like he was getting a VIP treatment. Now, there are two key reasons for why the truce has held since last fall. The two leaders, of course, had met in South Korea last fall in Busan, which was where the truce originated from. One reason is that after a couple rounds of chicken last year, I think both governments recognize the pain that the other side can still impose on their economies and the dependencies that still bind the development of the two countries. And here I'm referring to the fact that the Chinese possess dominance in rare earths processing, and that the US still possesses considerable leverage, particularly in advanced technology and lithography. And these dependencies are not going to be changing in the near term. Now, a second key reason why the truce is holding, and a key reason for why we think the truce will continue to hold, is because both leaders are invested in that stability and see it as useful for their purposes. So for Xi Jinping, a stable US-China relationship is the key to having a stable external environment for China. And that stability is useful so that he can focus on transforming the Chinese economy into a techno-industrial power. Beijing's preference would be to lock in that stability for the remainder of Trump's term. And then for Trump, the summit was quite useful as well, and the truce, to generate discrete deals that he can claim as political wins, particularly at a moment when his approval ratings are coming under increasing pressure, and voters are increasingly unhappy with the US economy. So the summit in May has really reinforced that leaders' level commitment to stability. Now, when we look at the outcomes, and I won't go into the specifics of the outcome, and I suspect Scott will get into that as well. There's a table there with a lot of words, but just to note here that despite the overall positive feelings, the actual trade outcomes that were reached were not very ambitious. They were sort of low-hanging fruit, and they left a lot of details to be hashed out, right? There was a promise that the Chinese side would be purchasing $17 billion of agricultural products for the next few years. There's talk of the Board of Trade identifying $30 billion of goods on each side, non-sensitive, that would be on which there would be tariff adjustments, right? But those negotiations are ongoing, and we don't have clarity about what commodities are included, which goods that they have identified. The summit appeared to produce a degree of consensus around tariffs going forward. And in our calculation, and here I should note that every organization and governments use different kinds of calculations for the average effective tariff rate. But we expect that tariff rates, because of this consensus, is likely to rise to the rate around where it was during the Busan truce last year, meaning it could possibly rise to where it was before the Supreme Court ruled that the IEEPA-based tariffs were invalid. Okay. So back to the sort of political outcomes, which we see as the most significant outcomes of the summit. Now, one key outcome was that the two sides emerged using this shared language of, quote, constructive strategic stability to describe the relationship, which affirms the importance that both attach to bilateral stability at this moment and signals a willingness to keep competition within limits. Another major outcome was on Taiwan. Trump's characterization of the government in Taipei as independence seeking and as potentially posing a risk to cross-strait peace was a significant summit gain for China. Such framing really increases the likelihood of Trump continuing to negotiate with China on forms of support to Taiwan, including on future arms sales. And of course, another political outcome, quite concrete, is there was agreement on a Xi state visit to the US in the fall. Okay. So next slide, please. So despite the sort of positivity around the summit, it's useful to remember that the competitive core of the relationship has not changed and is unlikely to change. And there is a degree of fragility just below the surface. So strategic competition remains a driving dynamic. Both Washington and Beijing see the current truce as useful for fortifying themselves for the next round of competition. This détente affords both sides really the time and the space to be reducing dependencies on each other, the dependencies that are currently limiting policy options for each side. Each side is looking to build new leverage points to constrain the other in the future. So the US will seek alternative supply chains for processed rare earths and magnets. China will seek to innovate out of their reliance on advanced tech from the West. And this means that there will, in this interim, still continue to be some simmering friction beneath the surface of stability. We've seen in recent months that China has been codifying additional retaliatory tools that could, in the future, potentially be used against foreign companies in governments, tools that are meant to deter companies and governments from pursuing what the Chinese would view as discriminatory trade practices and discriminatory investment policies. The Chinese have also announced an outbound investment regime that seeks to control the flow of Chinese tech outwards. For the US side too, we see that the Trump administration, even in the last 2 weeks, they're seeking to close loopholes to its export controls and adding companies to some of their procurement restrictions lists. There are also, of course, trade investigations that are ongoing. I should note that much of the bureaucracy in the US and Congress still has a more ideologically competitive frame of mind. The Trump administration has, since last fall, sought to take steps to keep the bureaucracy in line with the direction that the White House is setting, and that for now seems to be holding. Another point of friction that could arise would be from third countries. So China's relations with Russia, with Iran, with the DPRK, that could potentially emerge as points of friction going forward, depending on what happens in Ukraine, depending on what happens in negotiations between the US and Iran. And of course, the Trump administration's Monroe Doctrine, an element of which is to reduce Chinese economic influence in Latin America, could be a point of friction as well. Another source of fragility is simply that because, as I have alluded to previously, this is very much a leaders-driven détente, it also means that the relationship could return to volatility at a leader's whim. Okay, so given all of that, Eurasia Group's view is that this current stability will last until at least for the remainder of 2026, and that while frictions and tensions will remain and occasionally flare, that they will remain managed. That momentum is going to be maintained through leader-to-leader engagements. 3 more meetings are possible this year. The September one looks fairly confirmed, and there's a possible engagement around the G20 in the US and APEC in Shenzhen. And on the last point of this slide, so I've talked about what we think is the base case, which is stability for the rest of the year, but we also don't think that an upside scenario, a total reset of the relationship under Trump is likely a scenario. The engagements this year are unlikely to produce a major bargain or major deals that erode that competitive core, temporarily pulling back on hostile actions towards the other may be seen as politically sellable and strategically rational, but the costs of a major bargain are likely too high for either side to bear. Fundamentally, there is just insufficient political and strategic trust because both sides are still girding for future competition. Next slide, please. If we could have the next slide. And so the next point that the final slide here, I'll just end with a look further out. So of course, risks may reemerge under the next administration, one that could return to a more ideological framing of that competition with China. We could see the tightening of export controls going forward. We could see more explicit support to Taiwan, et cetera. So that is a possibility under the next administration. A very quick word on Taiwan risks, and happy to discuss this further in Q&A, and I'm sure Raymond will have a lot to say on this as well. But at Eurasia Group, we see Taiwan risks as pretty low in the near term, the risk of an invasion, a full amphibious invasion, as low in the near term, but those risks will rise over time. The focus of Beijing's energy right now is currently on non-military coercive tactics. And Beijing seems relatively confident in its playbook right now. It sees a number of ways to influence the situation across the strait that do not involve a sharp increase in military pressures. But of course, the presidential elections in 2028, both in the US and Taiwan, can change that dynamic and can change China's assessment. Then just last, very quickly, I know the foundation is very interested in implications for Asia more broadly, but I think for the most part, the region prefers stability, but we hear a lot of lingering concerns about the concept of a G2, right? And so while governments across Asia do not want to be forced to choose sides between the sort of regulations from the US side or expectations of aligning with US export controls and trade measures, and it doesn't want to be caught in the middle, essentially, between the US and China. We still hear a lot of concern from Asian governments about the idea of a G2, which would suggest that China and the US would sort of co-manage the rest of the world. There is still a lot of anxiety in the region and questions about the US security commitment. Okay, and maybe I will just leave that there. Thank you very much.
Thank you to you, Amanda, for this very interesting presentation, and you gave us a panoramic view of what are the state of things right now. We see that there's still a grade of competitiveness between both, although you see some stability, at least during 2026. And what you talked about Taiwan is very interesting. And we're going to come back to you with a Q&A about all these things after the presentations of Raymond and Scott. So now, please, we give the floor just to Scott. Please, you have the floor. And if you want to share your screen.
No, I don't have any slides to share.
Okay.
So I'm just going to make remarks.
Okay.
So it's good to be here with everybody, and I really liked Amanda's comments and looking forward to Raymond's as well. I'm going to put the U.S.-China relationship in a slightly different context than Amanda, but I think at the end of the day, you'll find overlap in our conclusions. I'm a little bit more pessimistic than her about the direction of the relationship, even though she wasn't trying to be super optimistic. I would say she was talking about sort of calmness and in the near term, but long-term risks. I'm not even comfortable with where we are at the present time. So let me explain why that's the case. So the U.S. and China, in our relationship, there are three large kind of problems that we have been trying to tackle for a long time. The first big challenge is about fairness. It's about how to divide the economic pie between us bilaterally and in our economic behavior internationally. China has a economic system in which there is immense party-state intervention in the economy, and market fundamentals don't drive that economy, and that has been a source of tension for the United States and many of Chinese trading partners over the years. The U.S. and China have significant security differences about the nature of the security architecture in Asia, and with specific regard to Taiwan, but not just Taiwan. There's a variety of places where we could come into conflict with each other. And finally, we have differences over all of the challenges that meet at the intersection of those two areas of economics and security, economic security issues, because we are military adversaries with regard to the Taiwan Strait and other issues. Those areas of economic interdependence are now seen as vulnerabilities on both sides. That's supply chain dependencies, technology leakage, data security, economic coercion, energy dependence, et cetera. These are all now seen as huge risks. Now, the historically, the U.S. has used different approaches to try and address these three challenges with China. From President Carter's administration in the late 1970s, when we first established diplomatic relations with China, up through the Obama administration, the U.S.'s primary strategy was engagement with China to try and integrate China into a U.S.-led rules-based order. And we made a lot of progress. The relationship was relatively stable. China joined a lot of international institutions. Its level of aggressive behavior internationally was relatively muted, and it looked like China's economy was moving in a market-oriented direction. But beginning in the in the noughts, in the 20 teens, things changed, and you could see that the frustration in the U.S. government rose significantly in the late Obama era, but certainly by the time President Trump began his first term. So President Trump, in his first term, his strategy was he wanted to protect the U.S.-led rules-based order, but he wasn't going to be patient and kind about it. He used elbows. He used tariffs. So launched an investigation in 2017, which in 2018 concluded China was systematically stealing intellectual property, and then imposed tariffs that were above MFN levels. That led to a negotiation and the phase one deal that was announced in January of 2020. That was his effort. And unfortunately, a week later, there was a global pandemic. Had there not been a pandemic, President Trump would have run for re-election in 2020 based on successfully keeping China in the international order using pressure. But that's not what occurred. And so the last year, the Trump presidency in the first term was just unmitigated sanctions on China week after week. When President Biden took office in 2021, for his presidency, he also was interested in protecting the U.S.-led rules-based order, but he was more pessimistic than even President Trump about the ability to keep China in that order in a way that would protect that order. And so during the 4 years of the Biden administration, they had all of zero negotiations with the Chinese about China's compliance with its economic commitments, with economic security issues. The Biden administration concluded it would be a full waste of time to negotiate with China. And so instead, they focused on investing in American industry, aligning with other allies to de-risk from China, and imposing restrictions on China. No negotiations. President Trump in his second term has gone back to a lot of the tools that he used in the first term, but with very different ambitions. So President Trump wanted to originally protect that order, rules-based order, in his first term. In the second term, he's fully obliterated that order. He, on Liberation Day, imposed extremely high tariffs on countries around the world, totally outside the rules of the game set by the WTO, any bilateral arrangements the U.S. had with any other countries, and has basically walked away from the multilateral economic rules-based order to this very day. They're totally uninterested in using the WTO and other types of multilateral mechanisms to come up with ways to force compliance with multilateral rules. On the security side, the same thing. The rules related to the use of force with regard to sovereignty, threats to one, and self-defense, they've done away with those, and they've lowered the bar radically for the use of force. Of course, the U.S. regarding human rights and its views there have changed fundamentally. That is the basis for how the U.S. now is engaging in China. It is not trying to bring China into that old order. It is trying to interact with China based on the Trump administration's very new, very different conception of its view of the order and the U.S.'s role in that order. It's a much more illiberal view than previous administrations. Well, what has that got us? It has gotten us constructive strategic stability. That's the that's the tagline from the summit. You could add, based on fairness and reciprocity, which is sort of the US's addition to those words. This is a this conclusion in some ways makes a lot of people and businesses happy because, yes, we have a ceasefire in place, and the likelihood of a escalation in the near term is relatively low. But I think we need to recognize that this stability is on China's terms. This is exactly what the Chinese wanted out of the relationship. If you look at the China kind of challenges that we have with China, the Trump administration is dealing with them in a way that makes China quite comfortable. So on how to deal with economic issues and dividing the pie, the U.S. has abandoned in direct discussions with China anything about overcapacity, imbalances, China's economic model. The U.S. that was not a part of the discussion in Beijing or bilateral negotiations any longer. On issues of security, the U.S., the Trump administration, at least the president, has started to use Beijing's perspective on how to describe the challenge, which is that this is a challenge caused by uh, independence forces in Taiwan and U.S. support for Taiwan. The president did not mention that a key source of the problem is growing Chinese threats and against Taiwan, thousands of military exercises, gray zone tactics, intervention in Taiwanese politics. And so China is very comfortable with that direction. And on economic security issues, again, the U.S. willing to heavily restrain its use of economic security tools vis-a-vis China, and very minimal restrictions on the Chinese as well. So this is a stability built on uh, a foundation that China is extremely comfortable with. And we got this, as Amanda said, because of China's successful imposition of rare earth restrictions, in which forced the U.S. to back down. So April 2, 2025 was officially a Liberation Day announced by the U.S., but that was China's Liberation Day. And so we're now in a place of stability because of China's effective reading of the Trump administration and imposing and getting them to back down. And so the agreement that came out of the summit in Beijing, yes, it's a small, narrow agreement, but it's exactly the kind of agreement China is comfortable with. So none of the dangerous things that would threaten China's system were discussed. And so this was a discussion about beef, beans, Boeing's, the Board of Trade, the Board of Investment, none of which will fundamentally address any of the original challenges that the U.S. historically has had and that other countries with China have as well. And so even on economic security, the issues related to this dialogue around AI governance and safety will probably not produce very much. But it's just because the Trump administration is not really deeply interested in these negotiations or pushing China to change. So I do agree, just for the last couple minutes on this. Uh, Looking forward, I do think we're likely to get to a summit on September 24th. Um, there are some potential obstacles. The U.S. is now considering uh, increasing tariffs using Section 301 tools related to investigations on forced labor and on overcapacity. We know exactly that for sure that those investigations will conclude everyone is doing things wrong and justifies new U.S. tariffs. The U.S. is considering new restrictions on export controls and other things. The Chinese as well. My guess is those actions won't really fully get in the way of a summit, but they could. I think another potential obstacle to a summit is the inability of the Trump administration to plan and to plan ahead. And so it was okay for Xi Jinping and the Chinese to host a summit where there was almost no planning when it was in Beijing, and it was the Americans who had jet lag, and Xi Jinping could control the activities. But for Xi Jinping to get on a plane and fly all the way around the world to go to Washington, where President Trump is in control of things, that increases the bar for having more in place, and they may not. Xi Jinping has gone as far as Pyongyang in his recent travels. It's unlikely that he's going to go all the way to Washington, let alone to Miami in December, if there's not more in place. So I still think the base case is that they'll find a way to get a summit in Washington in late September. I'm not sure about Shenzhen or Miami. But nevertheless, there's these challenges. None of this is going to solve any of the big challenges that the U.S. really has, that Amanda mentioned. And so I'm quite concerned that as we get past the midterms, especially as we move towards the campaign for the next president and certainly the next administration, there could be a snapback. That wasn't her language, but we could see a significant change in American policy to try and address these three challenges of economic fairness, security, and economic security in ways which are much more aggressive, which harken back to the Biden administration, but much further than that, to try and recreate a bipolar balance of order in which the U.S. tries to force as many countries as it can into its camp, security-wise and economic-wise, and essentially radically reduce the connectivity with China. I think that's the most likely alternative to the current approach. And so that would fundamentally change where we are from a world of de-risking to a world of decoupling. I think to avoid that outcome is going to require extensive conversations amongst scholars, amongst businesses, amongst allies, to look for some different kind of middle ground between where we are right now, which is basically a ceasefire on China's terms, to look for something somewhere and a sort of a much more aggressive period of conflict. So getting to that space is going to require a lot of work. I think APEC, the business leaders there, through other multilateral and regional mechanisms, need to do a lot of work for us to avoid that kind of back and forth between where we are now and where we could go in the future. So let me stop there.
Thank you, Scott, for this very interesting presentation on how you see things are going to move on. You gave us some highlights on what has been taking place before Trump and since Trump till now, and what may come in the future with a new administration. Very interesting points. We're going to come back to that, but there's the many things that we would like to deep in, and also I invite the other panelists to post questions between all of you, because I'm sure that there's some things that they're not all the same. So we're going to come back to you, and we already have some questions as well. I'm going to read them with you so people can hear your answers. And now I give the floor to Raymond, if you want to share your screen.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. I apologize. We're at the council. We're hosting a celebration of America's 250th birthday. So I'm in Sears Tower in one of these little tiny workrooms. Hope everyone can hear me okay. Let me see if I can share my screen here. There we go. Can we see everything?
Yes, perfect.
No. Great. Okay. I'm going to actually crib off of Scott's discussions about international order to discuss Asian regional dynamics. I think one of the main challenges with talking about, what the U.S.-China relationship augurs for Asia or even the globe is just given the diversity of different interests and how they interplay with each other. So instead, I want to talk about, kind of harken back to the discussions about the academic discussions about international order. And so, oh, that didn't. And so when we think about international order, I'm specifically referencing John Eckenberry's work in 2001. Literally wrote the book about international order. He calls an order of the governing arrangements among a group of states, including its fundamental rules, principles, and institutions. And in my mind, an international order has to do two things. First, it has to attract foreign partners. You have to give states a reason to want to join. You don't have to get all states a reason to join, but you have to get some subset of them to say, you know what, I actually want to follow your leadership. And then secondly, for the hegemon, the order has to provide some degree of domestic benefits. I'm going to bracket the domestic side perhaps until the Q&A. Instead, I want to focus on the attraction of foreign partners because there's an issue here. As a hegemon, your interest generally is in establishing and maintaining an overall system. You're focusing on diffuse benefits, specifically public goods, and you want to facilitate your own international leadership. By contrast, the opposition or the opposite of this sort of hegemonic role is one more that we associate with a rogue state. Reject the overall system. You focus on very short-term, specific transactional benefits, and you almost in some sense embrace this pariah status. And so for the United States, especially coming out of World War II, it had an issue. We often think that establishing international order is simply a matter of power, but oftentimes it's as much a matter of legitimacy. So coming out of World War II, the United States had its sufficient strength to defeat every single country in the world at the same time. And we might think that's a positive basis for imposing, let's say, like an American empire. But instead, I want to actually kind of bastardize a phrase from Spider-Man, which is that, we often say with great power comes great responsibility. Instead, with great power comes great liability. Because you are so strong, other countries cannot trust that you're actually going to commit to certain agreements. They're not sure how durable those agreements actually are. The way out of this, at least according to Eikenberry and what the U.S. did, was what he calls a constitutional order. What he ended up saying was, let's do some institutional binding. We're going to create multilateral institutions that have very specific rules that screen people who come in. You cannot join NATO if you are interested in territorial aggression in Europe, for example. And the U.S. will commit itself to these institutions and bind itself in these institutions. How do you know that you can trust the United States? Well, it enters these institutions. It gives you, these other countries, an opportunity to have input on its own policymaking process through these multilateral institutions. And what did this produce? One, probably the largest and most powerful alliance network in history, not just in Europe, but also looking at Asia, to some extent in Latin America as well. This is, according to Tom Long in his 2022 book, it is perhaps the most secure time for small states in global history. Territorial aggression for many years was just off the table. Trade got to levels that we haven't seen. Global trade has gotten back to levels we haven't seen since prior to World War I, and we have the Sam Huntington's discussion about the third wave of democracy. So ultimately, this sort of institutional binding, where the U.S. restrains itself through multilateral institutions, was provide benefits not just for the United States, but also for the global commons and for many countries around the world. Of course, we are not in that world anymore. The latest national security strategy has said that the days of the United States propping up the entire world like Atlas are over. And that gives, to some extent, an opportunity for the Chinese. When we think about their vision of war, oftentimes it's based on this, old parlance as peaceful rise, win-win development, a push towards a more multipolar system of shared governance and shared principles. What are those principles? Well, they're often embodied in these kind of trio, I think it might be a quadruple eventually, of global initiatives. Global development, we often think of this in terms of the Belt and Road Initiative, major sort of foreign assistance a vehicle by the Chinese going outwards. Global security initiative focusing on things like counterterrorism, I think climate change is on there, but kind of global commons challenges, and the global civilizational initiative, the latest one that's been added there about more global governance issues. This all sounds good. And the Chinese have certainly been consistent in pushing this out. But the challenge here is the credible commitment. A lot of this depends upon the Chinese willingness to maintain or advance these systems. But there's a lack of institutional binding. You'll notice that in each of these sort of global initiatives, we don't really have a multilateral institution where other countries can provide input into Chinese policymaking process. Much like in the United States, in China, we're seeing the personalization of domestic politics, so that Xi Jinping has attained a status in Chinese politics that we haven't seen since Mao Zedong. As a result, personalized politics, personalized dictatorships tend to be highly volatile in terms of foreign policy because the domestic and the foreign policy becomes linked together. And so that can lead to a degree of inconsistency as foreign policy is increasingly at the behest of domestic political considerations. Um, these initiatives, as I mentioned, focus on global commons. They're fundamentally positive sum in orientation. But what about zero sum questions? When we think of the Global Security Initiative, it is very explicitly not a military alliance. And there is definitely benefits to that kind of a structure, to having an institution that focuses on that. But in a lot of cases, we're dealing with a zero sum, and increasingly so, a zero sum security, economic issues. In that sort of situation, what does the Chinese vision of order, what does it actually entail? What commitments do the Chinese actually make? And lastly, it's not very clear whether or not the Chinese are actually interested in providing the diffuse benefits that underpin a global order. For example, Kindleberger talks about the hegemon and how it has to be the market of last resort and the reserve currency. There's really no indication right now that the U.S. dollar is going anywhere. In fact, I think in the last couple of years, it's actually gotten stronger and become taken a more central role in international transactions. The renminbi, it's not really clear that the Chinese want that to be a fully convertible reserve currency. Similarly, so the hegemon has to be the market of last resort. But given the kind of dual circulation approach to the Chinese economy, that doesn't seem likely either. That the Chinese will open its doors to foreign competition in its own domestic economy. They're dealing with other issues where they're trying to export to others, but in some sense close themselves off. And so this presents a difficult choice, not just to, I think, countries in the East Asian region, but also around the globe, and in particular with Latin America as well. Both the United States and China are potentially pursuing a much more transactional, short-term deals, focusing on specific benefits, not the diffuse rules and policies that will allow consistency across multiple domains at once. There's a question, therefore, about the durability of this constructive strategic stability. You know, how long will this actually last? Will it simply be a matter of the personal predilections of Xi Jinping and Donald Trump? If order and rules are not embedded within multilateral institutions, they become very, very brittle. And lastly, there's the contents of the order. Um, it's not exactly clear in making some of these deals with the United States in particular, but also with the Chinese, what countries are actually agreeing to, or how long that agreement will hold. To give you an example, Trump has lambasted U.S. trade relations with Canada and Mexico, imposing 50% tariffs on, say, steel and aluminum, and saying, our trade deals with these two countries are the worst we've ever, some of the worst we've ever done. Of course, the trade deals that we have were negotiated in his first administration. And so when we think about the durability of the order, we also have to think about the contents of the order as well. Where when it becomes advantageous on the short term to renegotiate these deals, to change what the contents of these deals actually entail, the Trump administration seems likely to take it. And so we're getting more and more erratic, especially on the U.S. side, more and more erratic policy that's both increasingly personalistic and volatile. And this puts other countries in a really difficult position. So if I were to give recommendations to those countries, I would, make three critical points. First, be explicit about what exchange you're getting, what you're giving and what you're getting back. Ambiguity in these deals, these agreements will only cut against you in the long run, given the strength that both the Chinese and the United States have vis-a-vis the rest of the world. Secondly, look at credibility mechanisms. How are you sure that the other side will actually hold up its end of the bargain? Does it come down to personal predilections, interpersonal relationships, or is it embedded within, legally binding, institutionally binding mechanisms? And lastly, I think the sequencing of payoffs. To some extent, make sure you get yours before the other side gets theirs first. It's unfortunate. I think these sort of short-term transactional issues that kind of underpin these recommendations they are they emerge from a more fragmented, less rules-based order. But unfortunately, that's essentially the world that we're living in, and these at least are my kind of most top-line recommendations for how to navigate that. So, looking forward to the discussion. Happy to go anything further, and thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you, Raymond. Thank you to you for your very interesting presentation and these concepts that you gave us. I'm going to start with your last slide where you give us some recommendations. You talked about explicit exchange, credibility mechanisms, sequencing of payoffs. To whom are they addressed? How does a small state like Chile, for example, build credibility when both great powers go transactional? How can we manage in this world, in this new scenario?
That's a great question. I'm not saying it's going to be easy. Quite frankly, far from that. I, you know, to some extent, it's using the credibility mechanisms that already exist within various countries' foreign policy-making processes. So, for example, domestic commitments, having things written into domestic law is a way to demonstrate the credibility of your commitments abroad. Similarly, so through multilateral institutions, institutions screen, they provide information. Adherence to those sorts of norms and those kind of rules demonstrates credibility. But I think fundamentally the issue in my mind is to go back to the Spider-Man issue, right? In general, small states are likely not to face as much of a credible commitment issue as the large states. It's because they're powerful that they have to find ways to demonstrate their credibility over the long term. And so, in a lot of cases, it seems to me that the domestic mechanisms, the international institution mechanisms, apply more to China and the United States than they do necessarily to the small states.
Thank you so much, Raymond. I'm going to move to Scott. If a world bipolar order eventually takes form, which is something you said may happen going forward, even the Democrats take back the White House, what role do you foresee for the Latin America in that context?
Sure. So I think if the United States, the next administration, I don't see that happening in this administration, but if the next administration, whether it's Republicans or Democrats, if you get hawks who are really orient American foreign policy against China and try to, they would push very hard for countries around the world, including in Latin America, to collaborate with the U.S. Extensively on reducing those dependencies on critical minerals, in chemicals, in all the areas in which China could potentially weaponize its economy, and reduce their interaction with the Chinese. So, for example, in the auto industry, China is now exporting extensively around the world, including to Latin America. They've established, BYD established a factory in Brazil, which could eventually become a platform for exporting. The U.S. has said that Chinese cars come, not only are they subsidized unfairly, they present data security risks because every car now is a cell phone on wheels, collects lots of data. The U.S. has adopted rules domestically through the Commerce Department, essentially banning Chinese vehicles that have any level of connectivity or autonomy. And the U.S. would be pushing countries around the world to also adopt those same kinds of bans in the same way that the U.S. In 2018 and 19 pushed countries to ban Huawei and ZTE equipment from their 5G networks. So you could see them making other kinds of efforts to do so. I think the challenge is that in a world in which the U.S. is less powerful, where its commitments are harder to accept, where China has a significant innovation capability and also the ability to impose pain and sanction others, that will put countries in a very difficult position I think all of us have heard this plea by others, don't force us to choose. And I think if the US was really trying to move down that direction, they would want others to choose. So that would set up a very significant, difficult, it would be very hard for countries to thread the needle and maintain reasonable relations with both. And so that would be much more challenging even than where we are now.
Yeah, indeed, Scott. And related to this, and you mentioned some of what I'm going to ask you, but just to go directly on the issue of investment, Chinese investments in Latin America, what's your assessment as to these Chinese investments in strategic sectors in LATAM, like critical minerals and critical infrastructure, and other regions of the so-called Global South, not only LATAM? Do you consider Chinese steps into strategic sectors in these areas are substantially changing the way the US is shaping its China policy? Do you think that there is a linkage in this?
Um, I think there is certainly real significant concern in many quarters in Washington, D.C. about China's extensive economic ties with the global South and the developing world more generally. It's not necessarily because of the Belt and Road or the BRICS or these kind of large advertising campaigns. It's really the genuinely extensive Chinese investment and ties in minerals, in other kinds of resources, and now in in telecommunications and in other areas which are increasingly binding these countries to China. Most of the developing world and global South, their number one trading partner is China now. And certainly that's a concern for the United States. The challenge, though, is what does the U.S. have to offer? The U.S. has not been offering a real alternative. It's certainly still a large investor in Latin America in a lot of different industries, but it is not, for example, in the auto sector, offering a serious alternative to the Chinese cars and those supply chains. It is not doing the same in many other sectors. And so I think the question isn't, is the US worried about this? It is can the US offer anything other than criticizing countries and pushing them to limit those relations with China? Can they offer a positive incentive to these countries? That's the same, in the Biden administration, they came up with the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, right? Which they offered as an alternative to TPP. That was really an empty shell of an agreement. And so I do think the question is whether it's the Trump administration or a subsequent administration, can they come up with positive incentives, market opening measures, investment that helps countries find alternatives to depending on China? And I think that's a real big challenge. I think intellectually people in Washington know that. The question is politically, can they do it? The Biden administration left in place all of Trump's Section 301 tariffs because they were too scared of unions. And they said, if we remove these tariffs, we'll lose the election. So they kept those tariffs in place. Now, of course, they lost the election anyway. So maybe they would conclude that they ought to do the right thing rather than what's the politically convenient thing. So that is a really interesting conversation going on in Washington right now.
Thank you very much, Scott. Do you want to comment on that, Amanda or Raymond?
Only to say that we're hosting Catherine Tai here later today, so Scott, I'll be sure to pass on those comments, which I honestly fully agree with.
Okay, thank you very much. There's another, Amanda, do you want to say something?
Yeah, just on the point about critical minerals, I do think that what we're seeing from the Chinese side is in ongoing state-directed effort to consolidate its dominance, to try to ensure that it holds on to that advantage as much as it can, but also to expand on it. So beyond rare earths, I think we're seeing increased interest on the Chinese side and increased investments in critical minerals more broadly across the global south. Of course, this is a point of concern and puts some Latin American countries in the crosshairs between the US and China. You have on the one side the US that's trying to sign up more countries to cooperate on critical minerals, whereas many countries, of course, are a key source of minerals for China, but it's also a source of leverage for Latin American countries, right? China is dependent on lithium and copper imports from Latin America. And I think just more broadly, I'd say that there's a comment in the chat box about how Southeast Asian governments are masters at balancing. I do think that what we've seen from a number of middle powers in the last year is a strategy of maintaining or creating optionality. So creating more options for your own country, for the trade partners that you have. And that's all part of that is remembering that it's not just about the US or China, it's about trying to find alignment across with other middle powers, right? To be multi-aligned rather than to think about things in terms of US versus China, where the other sort of trade agreements that can be signed in this moment of extreme uncertainty, who are the other sort of natural allies out there in the world. And of course, there is greater strength in numbers, so finding the sort of institutional or regional forums that can increase your bargaining power vis-a-vis either the US or China is also just a general strategy.
Thank you so much, Amanda. You just answered the question that had made Romario Hasugian from Indonesia in the chat. So we already answered one of your questions for that part of the audience. And there's another question, Scott, that is related with what we're talking now, and it comes from former Chilean ambassador to China, Fernando Reyes Mata, who actually wrote a very interesting paper that we are going to put together with your presentations in our webpage afterwards. So for people who want to know about these issues, we're going to put it there. And he says, Scott Kennedy correctly states that there is an interrelationship between the economy and security. The United States has adopted the concept of dual use to classify many infrastructure, energy, and digital communication projects inherent to development as also having a military dual-use purpose. What are the limits of applying this concept? Where can a country like Chile find autonomy in these areas in the face of the US-China polarization?
Well, that's a great question, and it's one for which there is not a perfect answer yet. So the idea of dual-use technologies originates from long ago, and certainly U.S. export controls originally focused on weapons of mass destruction, but as we've moved into the digital technology age, there's more and more technologies which inherently have a potential dual-use capability. The U.S. has tried with others to try and create some conceptual boundaries about this. They talk about small yard, high fence. We make these boundaries by analogy. So small yard, high fence, which suggests the U.S. is going to focus on those technologies which have the most potential to affect a country's military capabilities or the foundations which feed into that. And hence, the Biden administration focused heavily on the most advanced semiconductors and semiconductor equipment. Also, because another principle for economic security and export controls is you put those type of controls on technologies where once you impose those controls, the target is unlikely to be able to get those technologies elsewhere, and they don't have them at home. And in the case of advanced semiconductors, the US, Japan, the Dutch, and the Taiwanese basically dominate the top end of semiconductor manufacturing and that equipment. And so it was the original intent of the Biden administration to really focus there. We're looking at some other industries, for example, in biopharma, where they did not have that kind of dominance and monopoly and choke points. They've looked elsewhere. And so originally, I think the idea was just that narrow space. But I think over time, they've begun to worry about other parts of the semiconductor supply chain, um, and including legacy chips that are less advanced but still extremely important for the military, other types of equipment, software, and tools, in an effort to more generally slow down China's progress in development of artificial intelligence. And so we've seen the yard get bigger, the fence in some areas get higher, but also leaky and have holes in that fence. And now China has its own fence and yard. And so I think if you look at the rules of the WTO or APEC, the G20, you'll find zero discussion of how to address these issues. I guess you'll find Article 20 of the WTO, which gives you a paragraph that says countries can protect their national security while minimally affecting commerce. That's it. You get to self-judge whatever you want to do. And so I think one of the large challenges going forward if we're going to have some kind of stable order is coming up not just with a personalized agreement between President Trump and Xi, to borrow Raymond's language, but can we come up with essential definitions and expectations and conditions for how to manage economic security issues when it's okay to do some things and when it's not. Right now, it's essentially a blank slate, and it just depends on the whims of what happens in any individual negotiation. So we're very, very far from managing those issues.
Thank you very much, Scott. Indeed, and you mentioned in your presentation that the durability of order depends more on personalities rather than in the multilateral order as we used to see it. What is the role of the international agreements? Do you think that they will have a major weight in this new order, the CPTPP or organizations like APEC? Do you think that they can play any role, or yeah?
Let me briefly answer, and I know Raymond and Amanda have views on this that probably better than mine. But I think it right now, if you look at global trade, probably about 80+% of global trade still follows MFN. And there are still new agreements being written and achieved between the EU and Mercosur. There are a whole variety of these regional arrangements that are being developed, partly in reaction to the disorder they see at the global level. And so there is still a lot of commerce that is following the existing rules of the system, and APEC and others are still working on these things. I think the question is that enough to stop the slide to greater and greater disorder? And I think a big question there is what level of ambition do middle powers and those who live and depend on the multilateral order have? And so we see in Canadian Prime Minister Carney's speech at Davos in January a call on middle powers to create an alternative to the ways in which the US and China are acting in violation of that order. So could you get enough economic gravity and effort to become an alternative and put some discipline on those larger powers? I think, to me, the big question there is is the EU willing to join CPTPP? If they were, that would create a potential enough economic gravity of TPP to be significant pressure on the US and China to change their ways. That's would require a lot because the EU still has a very close relationship with the United States. They depend heavily on each other on security issues. They're each other's number one, still very important trading partners. As unhappy as the EU and individual members are with Washington and with Beijing, they're not ready to fully cut ties and really put an immense amount of pressure on Washington. I think things would need to devolve worse for them to get that. But that would be the way in which, if you were looking to uh, put a floor under the international order and reconstruct it, the EU joining CPTPP would be probably the most likely major step that would work in that direction.
Yeah, and don't forget that China is applying to be part of the CPTPP, so that will be interesting to assess as well in the future. And well, as you say, it's going to be difficult to see the EU joining the CPTPP, but that would be very interesting. Amanda, Raymond, do you have any views on this? No?
Yeah, I mean, I fully agree with Scott. I think, what I would say is there is a need for middle powers to come together. Those powers should have, in aggregate, sufficient economic weight in order to push back against the Chinese and U.S. economic pressure. When thinking about the design of multilateral institutions, I would just recommend you go big, right? I think the comment about Southeast Asia being masters at the sort of hedging, I actually completely disagree. You look at what happened at the latest ASEAN summit. It's been what, 15 years of discussing, almost 18 years of trying to push for some sort of code of conduct with the Chinese. And every single time it even gets a little bit of momentum, the Chinese put pressure on the landlocked ASEAN countries to just kind of squash that. I actually would fundamentally disagree that Southeast Asia has done a good job in terms of hedging. And in fact, I would say a consensus-based decision-making approach as a multilateral institution is probably not great. And when you're trying to coalesce and push back against these larger powers. And so when I say go big, I mean go for a really deep integrative agreement on economic and trade and investment issues. And don't water it down. Go for really high and then use that as a screening mechanism to see who can come in, who's willing to join at these high quality, high level terms. And in that basis, you can then push back. I would also kind of mention a reciprocal challenge or an attendant challenge to this. We in our discussion are focusing a lot on states, and that's for a good reason. But we shouldn't forget about firms, that they sometimes have different interests than even the countries where they're based. So, for example, a friend of mine used to be head of Latin American security for Cargill, which I think is still the largest privately held corporation in the world. And I was saying to her, chatting with her in the first Trump administration, saying to her, like, man, this sucks for you. Like, Cargill owns 85% of the U.S. soybean market. The Chinese are no longer are the biggest buyer. They're no longer buying from us. This is terrible for you, right? Like, business must be bad. She's like, no, we're actually doing great. We also own 85% of the second largest soybean market in Brazil. So for them, tariffs had very little impact on their production, on their revenue. Production was maintained essentially on a firm level basis. And if you were a Minnesota farmer, terrible for you. If you're a Brazilian farmer, great for you. If you're Cargill, you're making out like bandits because you've got higher prices and steady production. All of which is to say that when we think about how Latin American countries can respond to the kind of the challenges in the U.S. Chinese economic relationship, just note that tariffs, MFN, as Scott was mentioning, produces trade creation. You get new trade that emerges because you have a common set of rules. Tariffs create trade diversion. It doesn't create trade, it just moves it around from one to the other. So there is a certain degree of surplus that might be seizable if you can be an attractive enough market, either on the firm level or the country level, or as an organization, to attract that investment and that trade into your system, as opposed to leaving it in the Chinese and American trade relationship.
Thank you so much, Raymond. Um, I'm going to switch to Amanda and go to the issue of the tariffs. You framed the summit as delivering the summit between Xi and Trump that took place just some weeks ago as delivering stability. Yet the tariff consensus could push the US effective rate from 23% to 30%. You also mentioned it. Is this genuine stability or just managed escalation? What's the half-life of this truce? And what single event would break it before Xi falls visit?
Thank you for that. So just on the tariff point, I actually thought it was remarkable that there was a consensus that was reached, it seems, from the language that you've seen in the statements from the two sides. And so I do think that signals a degree of understanding, at least between the two sides, and a shared expectation of where things are headed going forward. I don't see that, there is 301 investigations that are ongoing. And we will see the results of those supposedly soon. But I don't see that as sufficient for derailing the current momentum that we're on. I actually find quite compelling what Scott was saying. He attributed sort of he raised a question about whether the Trump administration would be able to prepare sufficiently for the September summit. And I find that to maybe be one of the most compelling variables in the lead up. To be totally frank, we knew that there was very little preparation in the lead up to May, which was a reason perhaps for why the sort of trade outcomes were a bit lackluster. But of course, there was a seemingly general disinterest about addressing the more structural economic issues that previous administrations have addressed. But in terms of what will break it, I think in the interim, so we do see this truce as holding for the remainder of 2026. I think that the midterms could be a turning point. The Chinese side do certainly see it as a potential turning point. We're going to likely see the Republicans lose the House. What that effectively means is that President Trump in the White House will have limited ability to push through its domestic agenda and additional domestic policies, with the exception of through executive actions, of course. And so what is likely to happen then is the Trump administration may focus more on foreign policy, and that Trump himself may see the foreign policy realm as the area to create his legacy in the ensuing 2 years of his term. Now, at Eurasia Group, we think the tendency is for Trump to focus on the Western Hemisphere. The administration has made clear in multiple national security documents that this is the priority for the administration. But of course, there is the possibility that the sort of need to find some sort of legacy on the foreign policy front, combined with what will likely be increased pressures from the Democrats, from Congress, right? Think a lot of oversight hearings, a lot of making public and questioning the administration about their policies on China, that it's possible that we could see a tightening of the Trump administration's approach to China. So we'll have to watch to see that play out post midterms, but I also suspect that understanding this dynamic, and the Chinese have been watching, are watching this quite closely. I suspect that at the September summit, we may see China offer more concrete deliverables to the US, knowing this. So for instance, one of the outcomes we expect at the September summit, so one, I think Scott Bessent has said this himself publicly, but there will maybe be the identification of the 30 billion for 30 billion, according to the Board of Trade. But also remember now the truce that was struck last year hasn't been extended yet. So the rare earths truce in particular. So the expectation is that they will reach an extension of that truce during the September summit.
Thank you so much, Amanda. Scott, do you want to comment?
Sure. I think it's important for industry and other countries to prepare for both potential upside, continuation of stability, and for downside, and for those risks. So um, um, so if we assume that we'll get to a September summit and there'll be some of those deliverables Amanda just mentioned, then you would potentially expect to see President Trump travel to Shenzhen for the APEC leaders meeting. And that would, if you get that, would then he would bring American companies and others would go, and then that would be an opportunity for countries and industry from others to try and further cement and lock in American commitments, Chinese commitments to keep that ceasefire going. That would be, the effort. Instead of the U.S. trying to tie the Chinese hands, we'd be trying to tie the U.S.'s hands down. That would be, I do think that, as I said before, there are potential ways that we don't get to a September summit and things fall apart. I'll mention one wild card I haven't mentioned yet that could affect things besides the lack of preparation or other things, and that would be U.S. courts. So these Section 301 investigations are meant to reimpose tariffs broadly across the world. But I think we need to be prepared for the possibility that let's say, once the Section 301 investigations are done and the new tariffs are announced, that the courts somehow find that most of those tariffs against on forced labor and on overcapacity may be justified against China, but aren't justified against the rest of the world. And so in that instance, you would see now the U.S. would have kept its commitment to not raise tariffs against China above where they were last October, but the gap between China and the rest of the world would increase dramatically. That would totally freak out the Chinese, who would then retaliate significantly against the United States. So I don't think that this is the U.S. trade representative's secret plan to somehow isolate China. But the U.S. courts could decide that in that way. And if so, that would lead to a re-escalation that we're not anticipating because it's not the result of intentions on either side. But I still think I don't know. I know the Eurasia Group puts percentages on different types of scenarios. I would put that one, at the 5% level, because I think we saw the U.S. Supreme Court reject IEEPA tariffs, and so they have put this in place, and so you could see other courts in the U.S. Put a stay on some of those tariffs, which would be that'd be a really dramatic result that is not in on most people's prediction sheet.
Yeah, and what happens to a small open trade dependent economy like Chile in a scenario like this, whose growth model was built on the open rules-based system? What do we do? We have some comments there of one of our Chilean ambassadors, Patricio Powell, that says that our friends in Southeast Asia are more prepared than Latin America. What do you suggest that we should do from this side of the world?
Is that directed towards me or?
Yeah, if you want to.
Sure.
I don't know if all of you can give us some clues. I don't know. Just.
I guess the first thing is hire some trade lawyers. But you have to be right now. I mean, we're in a world where you can't prepare for a single outcome. You have to prepare for multiple outcomes. Hedging is obviously a requirement, and being able to adapt to multiple kinds of circumstances. And I think as long as we have this kind of leadership in power, and we have these real significant tensions on both sides. This is not just a U.S. I mean, Amanda and I live in Washington. Raymond's lucky that he's a little bit away, so he's not in the heart of this earthquake. But it is unsettling. But China is really also putting a lot of pressure on the international system and on others. So a lot of times I've been asking other countries from different parts of the world, give tough love to the United States, and let us know. But that's really difficult because if it's piecemeal, that's challenging. It's very also difficult to put together the large kind of go big package that Raymond was suggesting. So I guess if aside from lawyers taking a lot of medication to manage your anxiety would also help.
Thank you so much, Scott. And thank you for the quote of humor on this, because we
Sorry.
will no, it's okay. We really need it. We will need it even more in the future, it seems like. Well, just
oh,
yes, Raymond, go ahead, please. Sorry.
oh, sorry, just to jump in there. I mean, medication wouldn't be bad, but I think two things. One is that for smaller countries, focusing on differential tariff rates as opposed to the absolute tariff rate that you get vis-a-vis the United States or say China is important. So, it's one thing if you're having like a 15% tariff slapped on you. It's another thing if your primary competitors have a 10% tariff slapped on them. So you're already starting with a 5% deficit. Ensuring that you're equivalent to your major trade competitors is going to be helpful in the long run. Just accepting that there might be a certain degree of tariff rates from the United States. Okay, sure. Just so long as we're not worse off than our competitors and we're all on even footing, excuse me, then that would be, I think, a positive. And the second thing is, for export-led development models, one of the critical things is that you're using the international market as a disciplinary function on your own companies. That yes, you're going to drive government investment towards specific kind of national representatives or that kind of thing, but they have to be competitive fundamentally. With a tariff regime like that works under an MFN system. It works less well under a system where you have these kind of swirling tariffs. So you have to find a way to impose market discipline on those firms to some extent in the absence of the international market being able to do that for you. That could be a combination of government regulation, exposure of your kind of national leading firms to foreign competition that falls under an MFN system. But it's a tricky one to do because it's politically more difficult. You have the domestic government has to then impose some of this disciplinary function, and not all governments are able to do that, especially given the kind of relative balance of power between a government versus its own major firms.
Can I make just one last serious comment?
Yes.
And apologies for my humor, but in terms of what countries or companies can do, and this gets to something that Raymond and Amanda were saying before. So for smaller countries where you don't, in terms of overall economic gravity, have a lot of influence and power, what you can do is specialize. And you can become critically important and indispensable to one or both sides. All right. And so that's what Taiwan has done. Taiwan has invented the semiconductor fabrication where the contract fab, which no one had, and TSMC is way better than anybody else. Everybody, the Chinese, the Americans, everyone needs Taiwan. That is important for Taiwan's economy. It's also important for its security. And so specializing and becoming the best in something is highly valuable. Of course, that also has the potential downside of distorting one's domestic economy if you put all of your eggs in one basket. And so in Taiwan, there's a lot of anxieties about how important the semiconductor industry is relative to all of the other industries. And so they've talked about trying to diversify their economy. But so anyway, these global circumstances put smaller countries in a position where they have to face these kinds of trade-offs.
Thank you so much, Scott and Raymond and Amanda. We have reached our time, and it's been very interesting. Thank you so much. And we hope to see you in a future webinar on this issue. Many things are going to happen in the next months. We hope that this stability prolongs more than at the end of the year. And we're following you in your publications. And it's been an honor to have you here today. Thank you so much for all of you.
Thank
you so much.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.